Thanks very much for South London for inviting me to speak tonight. And if you're watching this on Facebook later on, hello to you too, wherever you are in the world. I want to talk about Keir Starmer, Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. I want to place it in context. The context is the massive crisis that is sweeping the globe of coronavirus and the questions it raises about the system under which we live. We know tonight that officially 18,000 people have died in hospitals in Britain. The Financial Times this morning had an analysis which suggested that the true figure then was actually 41,000 people who had died. Globally, the very lowest estimate would be 180,000 people had died, but as many other governments are carrying out the same exercise as the British government in trying to suppress the true number of people who've died, it is undoubtedly very much higher than that, and it will grow and it will continue. And particularly if it sweeps into the global south, the societies that have been weakened by decades of neoliberalism and imperialism, the toll will be very much greater. So we are facing a very, very serious moment in front of us. And we've learned, haven't we, the complete inability of the present system to deal with such a crisis. Britain is a particularly awful example, but it's not just the personality of Boris Johnson and his coterie that mean that there was not sufficient planning, that there was 10 years of austerity policies which undermined the National Health Service and other caring services. That meant that there was of protective equipment, that there was a failure of to bring about the sorts of policies that were required. It's not just the policies of Boris Johnson, it's a wider program of neoliberalism, which is why we see from Donald Trump to France to Italy to Spain the same sorts of failings, even at a different level, to those which we see in Britain. So the question, I think, is the Labour Party under Sir Keir Starmer or under Jeremy Corbyn an instrument to deal with this crisis that faces us? And to be clear, coronavirus is, of course, something that grew out of the capitalist system as it exists. It was occasioned by the expansion of exploitative, aggressive capitalist development into rural areas which had not previously been developed. That's one example of a pandemic which is occasioned by capitalist development. But capitalism also, if we had been doing this meeting 3 or 4, 6 months ago, we would have been talking about how capitalism threatens us through the emergency of climate chaos, which has not gone away, by the way. So capitalism threatens us in terms of pandemics, in terms of climate crisis. It threatens tens of thousands, millions of people on a daily normal basis across the global south in terms of a weakening of their health systems, in terms of malnutrition, in terms of disease that should be stopped but isn't stopped. And it also threatens us through nuclear war. Can the Labour Party offer us a way out of this? And certainly under Sir Keir Starmer, the early indications are not very good. You will have noted that Sir Keir's earliest pronouncements were to say that he was not going to have opposition for opposition's sake against the Tory government. And what he has done is very much to prioritise a notion of national unity, so-called, a national unity which always ends up being in the interests of the people at the top of society, rather than a rigorous and systematic critique of the Tory government, let alone an attempt to encourage resistance to what's going on at the moment, because we certainly need resistance. The most hopeful moments, I think, that we've seen during this crisis have been when working class people have, for example, said that they are not prepared to continue going to work, to produce non-essential items, to work for multinationals who are risking their lives in the pursuit of profit, or people who have said We know we are in essential areas like the National Health Service or people who are working in the supermarkets and for the Royal Mail and so on. But we want to have proper protection when we do those jobs. We need more of that sort of assistance. And it seems to me that any genuine force that is putting forward its ideas at the moment would be both insisting that people don't go to work in non-essential industries and also encouraging resistance by those who are in essential industries to get the protection that they require. So certainly Keir Starmer and the new Labour shadow cabinet, which he's put in his ministerial team, figures like Wes Streeting, Ed Miliband, like Jess Phillips and so on, from the right and the centre-right of the party, are not going to continue the sort of critique that we saw under Jeremy Corbyn. I want to say, though, that I don't think you can reduce the problems that the Labour Party faces to simply the election of Keir Starmer. Let's think about the obstacles to social change that exists within the Labour Party. One we've learned recently is the way that the bureaucracy, the administration of the Labour Party, act in order to sabotage a left-wing leadership. And it's very, very clear with the revelation of the emails and Facebook messages and WhatsApp messages that came out recently that the right wing of the party, in the party headquarters, were determined to ensure that Corbyn was undermined. So let me just give you a couple of examples. One is that there were dozens, indeed hundreds of messages which talked about policies such as an increase in corporation tax, that's an increase on the profits that are taken by business, and renationalisation of the railways as trot policies, which had to be defeated, Trotskyist policies. In other words, the most mild reformism, truth, slightly increase in the tax on business, was associated with the idea of the revolutionary wave of the Russian Revolution and subsequently from 1917 to 1924. That's the mindset of these people, that interfering in any way with the, quote, right of capitalists to make their profits was Trotskyism. That's how they saw it. They also did everything possible to defend the right wing. The report is 850 pages, so not many of you will have struggled through it. But one example is of the treatment of a man called John McTernan, who's a leading figure in the right wing of the Labour Party, who wrote a series of articles, for example, in the Daily Telegraph, praising the Tories, attacking Labour, but the government unit of the Labour Party refused to take any action about it. They did finally take action when he wrote an article encouraging the Tories to crush the rail unions. The action was not to discipline him, but to discipline someone who had said he should be suspended because of such an outburst. Another example is a man called Andy Bigham, who was reported to the government's unit for suggesting that Corbyn was a traitor and that Diane Abbott should be locked in a box. This was considered insufficient for action to be taken against him. And action was still not taken when he subsequently posted that he had voted Conservative, urged others to vote Conservative, and become the administrator of a Conservative Party Facebook group. No action was taken against him. And we know that, on the other hand, a whole number of people who had simply criticised the policies of the Israeli government or who had suggested that Zionism was a racist ideology were suspended, expelled, and so on. That's a reality about what was at the centre of the Labour Party in the run-up to the 2017 general election. I've said many times at meetings like this that the right wing used to pretend they hated Corbyn because he wasn't electable. The truth was, it wasn't that they feared he wasn't electable, they hated him because they feared he was electable. and that he might therefore get into office and bring about a change from the automatically pro-austerity, pro-business policies that had dominated the Labour Party up to that point. Corbyn was undoubtedly a break from such an idea. You know, he was different to those people in the Labour Party hierarchy. He was different to Ed Miliband or Gordon Brown or to Tony Blair, goodness sake. He was someone who talked about breaking from austerity and someone who talked about a different sort of foreign policy which did not automatically line up behind the United States and its imperialist projects. And he was hated by many in the ruling order because of it, not particularly because the program he put forward was especially left-wing. It looks so compared to Blair and Brown and Miliband and so on, but because it could have encouraged a much sharper confrontation by working class people with the system as it existed. And you see, I think it's easy to criticize Keir Starmer, and we should criticize Keir Starmer. It's easy to criticize those right-wing people inside the Labour Party. But what all of us have to really think about is the obstacles to change go deeper than simply the right of the Labour Party. This is what made the election defeat of the 12th of December 2019 such a shattering moment, because previous election defeats, the left had always said, if only we had a left-wing leader, if only we had a more left-wing manifesto, then we would be able to win. And this time there was a left-wing leader. This time there was a more left-wing leader, a manifesto. And yet Labour did not have a good election result. I've written an article about in depth about this in the recent issue of International Socialist Journal, if people want to follow it up. I'm not going to go into it detail now, but it's clear that it was a blow to the left because it undermined that idea that the only problem was a right-wing leadership or a right-wing manifesto. No, I think, although you can look at things like the role that the media played, it's undoubtedly important, those sorts of questions, the capitalist media is always going to be against anyone on the left. That's a universal truth, I'm afraid. And therefore, we have to dig a bit deeper. And here, I think we have to look at the nature of Labourism itself, those sort of social democratic parties, if I can call it like that, the parties who see the need to change society, but think it's necessary to do it through the existing mechanisms of parliament and of doing things through the normal methods. And there's a problem with this. Number one, it privileges the role of members of parliament. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing that not one of the members of parliament was reselected, in other words, was removed from their position and someone more amenable to Corbyn. Not a single one was removed and reselected during the whole period of Corbyn's leadership. Now, why was that? It's because a party that says the critical arena of where change comes about is parliament inevitably prioritizes and privileges the MP's role inside the party. That may not be formal. They don't have the same level of voting power as they once did in the Labour Party, but in practice, they are almost untouchable, almost untouchable. And the reason for this is because of the drive for unity inside the Labour Party. The terrible truth is that Jeremy Corbyn and others on the left believed that it was necessary to make concession after concession to the more right-wing figures of the Labour Party in order to hold the party together, in order to try and win a general election. Think about a few examples. The question of anti-Semitism, so-called, which I've already mentioned. Of course, anti-Semitism, wherever it exists, and it did exist in some places, tiny minority of cases, in the Labour Party, as it does more broadly in society, but actually was less in the Labour Party than wider in society, and certainly was nothing compared to the sort of anti-Semitism that existed and still exists inside the Conservative Party, let alone regimes like that of Viktor Orban in Hungary, which the Conservatives cuddle close to. It has to be opposed, always and everywhere. But Corbyn gave in to the idea that there was a real problem with people who wanted to criticize the Israeli government, and eventually acceded to the notion that the idea that Zionism, the motivating ideology of the Israeli state, to say that was a racist ideology was in some way to connive with anti-Semitism. And the Labour Party adopted that form of definition because of the concessions the left made to that spurious criticism. It's an extraordinary fact, think about it, that Jeremy Corbyn, a man who spent his whole life campaigning against nuclear weapons, went into the general election in both 2017 and 2019, pledged to upgrade the Trident nuclear missile system. Now, Jeremy Corbyn doesn't believe that for a minute, that that's the right thing to do. Nonetheless, he did it because it was seen as a way of creating unity inside the parliamentary party. And if you think about the question of Brexit, Brexit, the left inside the Labour Party either itself pushed for or acceded to the idea that there would have to be a second referendum and possibility of overturning the Brexit vote in order to pacify sections of the right inside the party and sections of the centre and even sections of the left agreed upon this. This was a disastrous policy when it came to the general election. Not one I think that Jeremy Corbyn particularly wanted to go along with, but he did it in order to fit in with the wider cause inside the party. And this tells us something about the nature of parties like the Labour Party. But there's actually a bigger problem as well, which is that Corbyn wasn't really tested. Corbyn didn't get into office. Corbyn was defeated before he got to office. But if you look at every previous Labour government or Labour-type parties in other countries at the moment, you will see that when they get into office or close to office, there is an attempt by the ruling class to limit, to hamper, to constrain, and if necessary, to destroy those sorts of parties. A couple of examples. So if you think about Syriza in Greece, elected in January 2015 as the hope of a continent, of a party which was a expression in some form of a wave of dozens of general strikes, of a student movement, of an anti-austerity movement, which had fought against the cuts of the Syriza, against the New Democracy government, and which had mobilized many people across Greek society. Syriza was an expression of that to some extent. What happened when Syriza was elected? It said it was going to abolish the austerity policies of its predecessor. It was told by the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, and the local rich that democracy is all very interesting, but it changes nothing. You still owe the money, you'll still have to pay it back, you have to carry out the same policies of those of your predecessor. You may have won an election, but power doesn't lie in Parliament. Power lies in those of us who control the factories, the offices, call centres, the services. We're the people who have the power, and we're telling you we're still in charge and you have to do what we have told you to do. Syriza made some noises about this. Eventually, it took to the Greek people a referendum in the summer of 2015 where it said, what do you think about this programme of cutbacks that the IMF the European Union want to impose on us. Are you for them or are you against them? And the Greek people said very, very clearly, we are against going along. It's a great victory, actually, for the anti-austerity movement. The result was, within a week, the Syriza government had said, well, democracy, again, is interesting, but the people who control society are those who control the means of production. And therefore, we are going to impose a worse austerity regime than that of our predecessors. And they ended up, didn't they, tear gassing pensioners who were protesting in Syntagma Square, the equivalent of Trafalgar Square in Athens, and rounding up refugees into detention camps and exiling them to appalling conditions in the Greek islands. Now, that's not about the personality of Alexis Tsipras, the leader of Greece. It's not about the particular personnel. It's about the fact about where power lies in society and how the capitalist state exists. And I could go on with the examples. Look in Spain, the Spanish state at the moment, where the radical formation Podemos has entered the Spanish government alongside PSOE, the Socialist party in Spain. What is that government doing at the moment? That is a government which is continuing with aspects of austerity policies of its conservative predecessor, and is now telling Spanish workers, not all Spanish workers, but wide sections of Spanish workers in transport, construction, and other parts of industry, to return to work, even when it's not safe to do so, because profit must be maintained, business must be maintained, and so on. If you want to look at another example, look at what happened to Bernie Sanders in the United States. Now, he was running to be the Democrat candidate for president. Now, the Democrats are not a party like the British Labour Party or PSOE or Podemos. They're a capitalist party, one of the great parties of American capitalism. Nonetheless, because Sanders was putting forward, again, some very mild reforms, something like the attempts to have a health service a bit closer to that of the British National Health Service, the result was that the Democratic Party crushed, that they made sure that he would not be the candidate. Now, this tells us something, surely, that those who are fixated on Parliament as the way to bring about change come up against the problems with inside their own organisation, pressures that brings about, but come up more profoundly against where power lies in society and the capitalist state. If you look at previous Labour governments in Britain, right, from the first one in 1924 onwards, you will find that these governments faced, firstly, economic sabotage, that there were investment strikes, runs on the currency, refusal to comply with normal economic modes by the big business and so on, to undermine and to pressurize those governments. But you also find that eventually each of those governments gave in to that pressure and ended up attacking the working class people who had put them into office in the first place. And this is the common occurrence that we've seen so often. So what I want to argue is, yes, Keir Starmer will be a particularly right-wing example, but that we need to have a movement that concentrates not on Parliament, but on the streets and the workplaces. And that's where real change comes about in society, by fighting from the bottom of the society, in our strikes, in our protests, in our occupations, in our campaigns, in our mass movements, that on the streets and the workplaces we can achieve real change, but that means breaking away from the sorts of methods that the Labour Party represents and talking about a revolutionary alternative. And that's completely obvious at the moment, that if we're going to fight racism, if we're going to fight against the attacks upon working class people's rights, if we're going to save our lives against what the government is doing over coronavirus, it won't be by parliamentary speeches or by parliamentary votes. It will be about organisation at the base of society. And although that's a specific example, we need to generalise that example. And therefore, the problem is not just the individuals, but what the Labour Party itself represents and the method of change that it stands for. And instead, we need to achieve a revolutionary transformation of society based upon a concentration on fighting at the base of society, in the workplaces and on the streets. Thank you very much.